Karen Carpenter was America's sweetheart, the squeaky clean, bright-faced personification of the girl next door. But beneath her well-scrubbed public persona was another Karen, one afflicted with low self-esteem and obsessed with her body image. The public Karen was idolized by millions. The inner Karen was unhappy and confused. And in the end, Karen Carpenter's private obsessions cost her her life.
We go on hurting each other.
Few performers in the last 25 years can match the artistic and financial success of Richard and Karen Carpenter, the quintessential brother and sister act, known worldwide as the Carpenters.
When the Carpenters first came out, there was nothing else like it on the radio, yet it permeated through everything.
Don't you remember you told me you loved me, baby? You said you'd be coming back this way again, baby. Baby, 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 oh baby.
That sound was created by Richard Carpenter.
The feel, the sound, the arrangements, the keyboards, just the texture of the sound. No one's ever duplicated that.
But Richard's contributions notwithstanding, it was Karen's haunting vocals and in the early days her drumming that crystallized the Carpenters' music.
I get goosebumps thinking about how beautiful she sang. She was like an angel almost. I mean, the purity in her voice was so fantastic.
Karen Carpenter's voice, in the world of music, jazz, classical, everybody knew this was an instrument that was rare. A dark voice with a tremendous range. She knew how to control it. She knew what it meant. She understood the emotional tie.
That emotional tie propelled the Carpenters' love ballads to the top of the pop charts in an era dominated by rebellious, loud rock and roll.
Look at the two of us, strangers in many ways.
Things were going on in the country. It was Vietnam. It was a civil rights movement. And the Carpenters were kind of a gentling force in this overall thing of rock and roll and long hair, and so radio.
This softer sound not only defined the Carpenters' music, but their personality. Jerry Dunphy, a Los Angeles news reporter, profiled them in 1971.
Karen and Richard Carpenter look like a couple of bright, well-scrubbed youngsters from middle America who happen to come up with a sound the public likes.
Richard and Karen Carpenter were born and spent their early years in New Haven, Connecticut.
I think Richard was more like his mother than Karen. Karen had her own personality. Really, she wasn't like her father either. She was different from the rest.
In 1963, their father, Harold, in search of a better job and a milder climate, moved the family to Downey, California. Here, they settled into a comfortable white picket fence existence. Richard, ambitious and driven, immediately focused on a pop music career, but Karen wasn't nearly as confident as her brother.
Her brother was the star. He was the older brother. He excelled in all these music programs at school, and I think she hid behind the drums. She was sort of insecure.
The duo was discovered in 1969 by A&M Records founder Herb Alpert.
He believed that sooner or later something was going to happen with us, and we did too, or we wouldn't have stuck with it. But when the Carpenters hit, it actually exploded.
Hit followed hit and tour followed tour. For 7 years, they roamed around the world, performing from Tokyo to the White House. The relentless touring took its toll, especially on Karen. Her insecurities, instead of diminishing in the face of her success, became more dominant.
She had just an otherworldly talent, but I think sometimes that can almost be a burden to have immense God-given natural talent.
I think she had moments of happiness, but I think that basically that she never really found what she was looking for. I think she was happy with her success, but for some reason she had this internal torment.
Karen's internal torment manifested itself in an extremely destructive manner.
She was just terrified of being fat, which is ridiculous, really. But how can you say when you're not another person?
Her utter fear of gaining weight was a byproduct of a disease now known as anorexia nervosa.
It looked very self-destructive, almost a slow form of suicide, kind of like what the alcoholic might be seen as. They drink and expose themselves to risks driving drunk. Well, so the anoretic, with very careless attention to their diet, put themselves at great risk.
In the next 2 hours, we will lay bare the incredible life of Karen Carpenter. Her sharp rise to fame, her complex relationship with her brother Richard, her attempt at independence, and finally, her tragic end. We will illustrate the story with never-before-seen home videos and pictures, reenactments, exclusive interviews with friends and celebrities, like record producer Phil Ramone and Dorothy Hamill.
She really gave me a lot of support. She was a true friend before we were really friends, you know, and that's a quality that not too many humans have.
Plus, Christina Ferrare and Casey Kasem. Karen Carpenter's story is a journey to the dark side of obsession and its tragic result.
Her life's ambition was to be a star.
Never recovered from the public
Karen Carpenter's story begins in Connecticut, in the middle-class industrial city of New Haven, in a real Wonder Years sort of neighborhood, recalls neighbor Teresa Vayuso.
This was always a nice area. It was a nice neighborhood. There might have been 21 kids on this short block.
Agnes and Harold Carpenter had moved to Hall Street at the end of the Second World War. Agnes remembers childhood friend Debbie Cudicello was strong-willed and determined.
We used to tease her because she would clean the window locks, you know, the locks and the little brass things on the windows. She would polish them. That's how fastidious she would be.
Harold, conversely, was passive and friendly. An industrial printer by trade, he worked at a carton factory. Their children at first glance were complete opposites. Richard, born in 1946, was a precocious child interested in all things musical, especially the piano.
I had the same piano teacher. My brother did too, Richard. And we just banged on the piano, and when Richard played the piano, there's a difference.
Karen, 3 years younger than Richard, was a sweet, good-natured, average-looking girl.
I think she was chunky and chubby like all pre-13-year-old girls. That's the way nature is. And then she thinned out.
Unlike her brother, Karen preferred a baseball mitt to a musical instrument.
I was out playing baseball and football and playing with my machine gun and very tomboyish.
Richard was more reserved, more on the quiet side than Karen. Karen was more outgoing.
But Richard and Karen shared a love of popular music.
Harold and Agnes collected lots of records, and down in their basement there was two swings hung from the rafters.
They'd swing and listen to the music, and Richard always wanted to play piano, and she, she took a little bit longer to take an interest. She liked baseball at first, and then she went into drums.
Get into the league.
Suddenly she wanted drums.
While Karen played ball, Richard formed a jazz group in high school. His piano prowess got him his first paying gig at a local pizza parlor. Richard was stricken with the show business bug, and he realized suddenly and irrevocably what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. Their father, Harold, meanwhile, was plotting to move the family to California. He took a scouting trip to the Los Angeles area in 1962.
He went first to check it out to see if he thought his family would like to be out. And when he found it great, they all went out.
They thought nothing's ever going to happen like in New Haven, Connecticut. So we got to get out west.
Right.
Yeah, that was home.
Right.
Yeah.
They just wanted to be in a surroundings where it might have happened easier, you know.
The Carpenter family settled in Downey, California, a nondescript town southwest of Los Angeles. Despite Downey's proximity to Hollywood, it was as blue-collar and sedate as New Haven. Richard enrolled in Downey High, to be followed 2 years later by Karen. Richard was an average student, but an extraordinary musician, recalls Bruce Gifford, a Downey High School music teacher.
His abilities and his, he played like a concert pianist, just a real pro. I mean, he had that technical ability that you just don't get without years and years of study. You know, it's just one of those things, and he just was natural. It was just a natural thing with him. He just seemed to just sit down and do it.
Karen, as she would for most of her life, followed Richard's lead.
She wanted to be in a band, and she couldn't play anything, but she did play a little bit of piano. So we put her on glockenspiel, which is the bells, you know.
The glockenspiel soon lost its appeal. Prophetically, she joined the Downey High School choir. Her reason? To avoid geometry. It was in the marching band that Karen discovered the drums, and drumming became a passion.
She goes to Music City and takes lessons from professionals. I mean, she started really learning to play drums. She didn't just pound away like most of the kids do. She learned to play.
Richard, after his high school graduation, enrolled in college in nearby Long Beach. His major, music. In 1966, he formed a trio with Wes Jacobs, a bass and tuba player, with Karen on drums. The trio, the Dick Carpenter Trio, had a regular gig at a Downey steakhouse. Through a friend, Richard met Joe Osborne, a well-known studio musician who had a small recording studio in the garage of this house in North Hollywood. One evening, Richard showed up at a recording session with Karen at his side.
A good friend of ours, Joe Osborne, who's a bass player around town. He's just a phenomenal electric bass player. And he had a studio in his garage, and he had a label for about 2 weeks. And we cut one of Richard's songs called You'll Love Me.
And when the song was played back, Osborne was ecstatic. "My God," he exclaimed, the girl could sing. Joe called an old friend, studio drummer Hal Blaine.
He called me one day and he said, "You know, I found these kids and they're just super. They're so good, and they've been recording in my garage." And he says, "I really think you ought to produce them."
Blaine passed, which was bad luck for him, because in less than a year, the Carpenters would be the hottest band in America. Coming up, the Carpenters sail into the top 10.
Herb Alpert called me up on the phone. "You want to hear something?" He says, "You want to hear something great?" And he played me this record over the phone, and it was spectacular.
And later, hints of trouble in paradise.
Her body was thin, too thin.
Truth.
By 1966, the Carpenters, Richard 19 and Karen 16, were actively trying to crack into the record business. And even though they were somewhat naive and, in the parlance of the time, square, they had two huge attributes on their side: Richard's innate ability to arrange a good tune and Karen's electrifying voice. The summer of 1966 brought another big break for Richard and Karen Carpenter. A chance to play at the Hollywood Bowl, recalls Richard's high school music teacher.
They had what they called the Battle of the Bands, and it was held at the Hollywood Bowl every year. And what they did is, you could apply, high schools could apply and send in tapes and stuff, and they had to go through trials and everything. Then the best bands were picked to play the Hollywood Bowl.
It was the Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands in 1966. We won. We also won a recording contract.
The contract was with RCA Records. In the fall of 1966, the duo went into a studio and cut 11 songs. But RCA, in a musical era enamored with all things psychedelic, saw little future in Richard's jazzy sound. In the summer of 1967, while San Francisco hippies celebrated the Summer of Love, Richard was banging out Dixieland tunes at Disneyland's Main Street, USA. That fall, Richard and college mate John Bettis formed a new group.
Karen had started singing by then, and we added some people that we had met at college and started this group, vocal group called Spectrum.
Karen, now 17, became as focused on success as her brother. It was at this time, according to Carpenter biographer Ray Coleman, that Karen, who was 5'5", went on her first diet, the Stillman water diet. 8 glasses of water a day, no fat and vitamins. She stuck to it rigorously and dropped 25 pounds. She now weighed 120 pounds. She would stay at that weight until 1973. Spectrum played campus gigs and several nights at the legendary Troubadour near the Sunset Strip. But when John Bettis quit the band, Richard disbanded Spectrum.
I mean, the guys quit because we couldn't get a recording contract, and we, went around for about a year trying to get someplace, and zero, so everybody went their own way. Karen and I started doing the stuff ourselves, overdubbing all the voices ourselves rather than have other people sing them.
It wasn't until the fall of 1968, after Karen enrolled with Richard at Cal State Long Beach, that they got their next break, a television appearance on a program called Your All-American College Show. The producer of the show was Warren Niles. His son, Denny, remembers the Carpenters.
The All-American College Show, we interviewed and put on national television acts and, single acts, groups, from all the different colleges in the United States. We found Karen Carpenter and her brother at Cal State Long Beach. And we put them on the All-American College Show, and that was their first time on television.
Here's your host, Dennis James.
Everything she sang with soul, with heart. None of the raucous stuff that all the other kids were doing. So she sang in a wholesome fashion, in a warm fashion. I'm trying to remember the very first song, Dancing in the Streets.
Here is the Carpenters' first television performance. It is interesting to note that at this juncture, Karen was much more confident behind the drums than in front of them.
And on this show that Karen Carpenter was on, as I said, that John Wayne was the judge, and that was the final. John Wayne, we had a party every final after the show backstage, and he stayed until like 1 o'clock in the morning. Very impressed with Karen Carpenter, and he was just about to do the movie True Grit, and he said she'd be perfect for it.
Karen actually read for the part, but was beaten out by actress Kim Darby. That hardly mattered to Richard, who was now convinced that he and his sister were going to make it as recording artists. And after this performance on the All-American College Show, Richard simply would not be sidetracked.
Richard was a great pusher. I mean, he just was when he went after something, he just pushed.
Karen auditioned for Kenny Rogers, who was looking to hire a lead singer for his group, The First Edition. She didn't make the cut. Meanwhile, old friend Joe Osborne, in whose garage Karen had recorded a year before, gave one of Richard and Karen's demo tapes to an old pal at A&M Records. It was the break they were waiting for, recalls studio musician Chuck Findley.
So Joe gave this tape to Jack Doherty, who was a producer at A&M Records. And Jack took it around to everybody at A&M and said, listen to this tape, listen to this girl sing. She's fantastic.
Eventually, the tape landed on the desk of Herb Alpert, a well-known leader of the band the Tijuana Brass and the A of A&M. His partner was Jerry Moss, a financial wizard. It was a perfect environment for Richard and Karen, recalls Claire Barron.
A&M was really known as what we called then either a boutique label or a family label. I mean, it was a label that wasn't owned by a conglomerate. I mean, it was owned by Herb and Jerry.
When we finally did get into A&M Records, it took Herb Alpert, who was a musician, and not, he's the musician half of the A&M. He's not the business half. And he saw what he liked musically in it and didn't stop to think whether it would sell or not. He just took us because he dug it.
Richard and Karen Carpenter, aged 19 and 22 respectively, signed an exclusive recording contract with A&M Records on April 22, 1969. They decided to call themselves the Carpenters, which Richard felt was a simple, unfancy name. A week later, the Carpenters were invited to perform on one of the sound stages, remembers record producer Phil Ramone.
I was at A&M Studios, and Herb Alpert said, "I want you to hear something." And he played a tape, and it was just phenomenal. And he said, "Come on." And we walked onto the sound stage, and I think it was Studio D, and there was Karen and Richard.
Not everyone on the A&M staff was overwhelmed, according to former A&M executive Bob Garcia.
I think my reaction was like, oh my God, how corny, because I was so ultra hip. You must understand that this was during the time of, it was post-Woodstock, and it was post-Altamont, and it was the Beans and the Love-Ins and drugs and all of that. And all of a sudden, here was what, I mean, at that time of my life, I kind of considered conservative, squeaky clean, not exactly dressed for success.
Herb Alpert immediately assigned Jack Doherty to produce and sent the duo into a recording studio. Their 1969 album was entitled, somewhat blandly, Offering. The song Invocation was a straight-ahead pop tune and was left over from their recording sessions in Joe Osborne's garage. A cover version of the Beatles' Ticket to Ride was their first single. It charted at a disappointing 54 on the Billboard Top 100. Fortunately for Karen and Richard, however, songwriter extraordinaire Burt Bacharach had heard Ticket to Ride and promised to look for a song that the Carpenters could record. Bacharach partner Hal David later sent over the music to They Long to Be Close to You, a song that had appeared 7 years earlier on a Dionne Warwick album. Herb Alpert persuaded a reluctant Richard to record the tune. Hal Blaine, who had last seen Richard and Karen when they were recording in Joe Osborne's garage, was brought in to play drums on the recording.
Jack called me in, said, let's get Hal in to play drums. So I walked into the session. Well, here they were now. They had already svelted down. Karen was looking real good. Richard was looking terrific. They really looked like a couple of Hollywood kids now.
Close to You was recorded in 3 arduous sessions.
Herb Alpert called me up on the phone, "You want to hear something?" He said, "You want to hear something great?" And he played me this record over the phone, and it was spectacular. And I just knew that that was a sensational home run.
A Grand Slam home run. The release of Close to You on May 15th, 1970 was an epical event in the history of pop music and in the lives of Karen and Richard Carpenter. They had stepped onto the roller coaster, and for Karen at least, it was to be a bumpy ride. Coming up, the Carpenter sound takes over the airwaves.
The country was starting to reshape itself, and civil rights again, and the war, and the women's rights, and everything was all starting to move. The Carpenters were kind of, to a lot of people, kind of an assuring thing that everything was all right.
And later, Karen's slow but inevitable breakdown.
We knew periodically that she was having episodes with weight control. And I guess there was an incident where she actually collapsed on stage in Las Vegas.
In the spring of 1970, A&M Records released the Carpenters' single Close to You. Neither Karen or Richard Carpenter nor anyone at the small record label anticipated the reaction to the simple love song. America went crazy, and the Carpenters overnight were rock and roll stars.
I remember the day that I heard Close to You on the radio. It was, you know, you'd have all this rock and roll and loud stuff on the air, and it was it had been a really hot summer, and it was a cloudy day, and there was like a thunderburst and rain, and then this song came on, and it was sort of like, what is this in the middle of all this, you know, loudness? And it was like a little angel singing.
It was, says music critic Paul Grind, the right song at the right time.
It's interesting that Close to You was released on May 15th of 1970, just 11 days after Kent State. And Kent State was really one of the symbols of the Vietnam era. And I think the fact that it was so removed from the tumultuousness of that era is one of the reasons it shot up the charts like it did. It hit #1 in 6 weeks.
The arrangement of Close to You that Richard did compared to the arrangement that I did for myself and for Dion, and the original record with Richard Chamberlain, I'd say is 20 times better, Richard's arrangement, than my arrangement. I really missed, and he really nailed it.
Karen and Richard were ecstatic, remembers Close to You trumpet player and regular Carpenter studio musician Chuck Findley.
They were thrilled, and especially when the album came out and they were like overnight success. You know, I'm talking about in 24 hours, all of a sudden you're nobody, and all of a sudden you are on the top of the world.
To promote Close to You, the Carpenters went on the road, a pattern they maintained throughout their career. By the end of the summer of 1970, they were back in Los Angeles, and Richard stumbled onto their next hit, We've Only Just Begun, recalls drummer Hal Blaine.
This was the Paul Williams song that was actually a Crocker Bank commercial.
Williams, then 29, had written the jingle with partner Roger Nichols. When Richard happened to see it on TV, he thought that it was perfect for Karen. He was right.
You've got a long way to go. We'd like to help you get there. The Crocker Bank.
Released only 3 months after Close to You, We've Only Just Begun was their second smash hit.
The hip people kind of snickered, but the fact is, you felt real good about having the Carpenters, especially in that time.
The Carpenters were an international phenomenon, recalls Derek Green.
The Carpenters' album in England, on the official industry chart, was, of the 52 weeks in the year, they were #1 for 51 weeks.
Success brought increased pressure to be even more successful. Sherwin Bash, who had managed Alpert's Tijuana Brass, was brought in to manage the Carpenters. A&M Promotions and Publicity Department worked overtime to refine and sell the Carpenters' all-American image.
I think people ridiculed the image. In part, the image was the work of over-eager publicists who seized on that hook of, you know, this clean-cut brother-sister duo from Downey. The all-American aspect of their persona was oversold, and it came back to haunt them.
I just remember people talking about them having chiclet teeth, you know, the perfectly white space teeth, perfect hair. Yeah, I mean, they were a brother and sister who still got along, you know, so, I mean, you got to make fun of that.
The Carpenters strove to maintain their all-American image. Richard had long hair, but it was groomed. Karen, just 20 years old in early 1971, dressed conservatively, especially on stage. Maria Galeazzi, the Carpenters' wardrobe person, remembers Karen's carefully crafted image.
Apple pie, I think, because you can see from the clothes, the stage clothes, that, you know, the granny look, which it wasn't sophisticated.
I think they were genuinely nice people, and I think they saw themselves based on that they were thankful about the fact that they were successful, and they never kind of moved away from that.
To stay successful, they toured and toured.
I remember those first years the Carpenters were on the road, 35 weeks, all the time. You know, they were constantly traveling, they were constantly everywhere in the country.
Way long time ago, we used to talk to people, and they couldn't remember a lot of places they'd been. We'd say, oh, now how could that happen? Well, I got news for you. After a while, you have no idea. It sounds dumb, but you can wake up in a hotel, and for a second there, you don't know where you are.
Elliot Abbott, then an assistant to Carpenter's manager Sherwin Bash, remembers those early tours.
Get him up in the morning. Get him in the cars. Let's get to the airport. We go to the next city. It's very glamorous, and you have a lot of free time. And you know, when you're done with it, you can't believe where you've been. And most of the time, you're not sure where you've been.
In 1971, anxious for a follow-up hit after We've Only Just Begun, Richard again stumbled onto a hit, this time while watching the wedding scene in the movie Lovers and Other Strangers. He was taken with the love song For All We Know. The Carpenters recorded it, and it became their third consecutive smash hit. That spring at the 1971 Grammys, the Carpenters won 2 awards, Best New Artists and Best Contemporary Recording Group. Professionally, Karen Carpenter had reached stunning heights.
All of this began for us, I guess, about a year ago with a release of a record called Close to You. And from that time, we have had the best year that anybody could ever ask for. But there's always been one thing that's been kind of hard for us to explain, and that's exactly how much it means to 2 kids from Downey, California, to share our music with audiences from all over the world.
Privately, however, not much had changed. Despite her age and instant fortune, she was still living at home with her parents. Agnes, her mother, ruled the roost. She even handled the Carpenters' finances. Karen and Richard didn't have much time to date or do promotion, so they combined the activities. Here is Karen in a rare piece of footage from the dating game.
Their newest album is called Offering, and you just heard their newest single, Close to You, at the top of the show. Please join us in welcoming Karen Carpenter.
Karen asked the usual penetrating questions.
What's the last thing you thought about before you went to sleep last night?
And in the end, chose the most dapper bachelor as her date.
We know that you and James will revel in the Royal English atmosphere, kind of fitting, which will be waiting for you when your date takes you to Roanoke, Virginia.
Richard was on the show as well, and though his appearance was a bit less dignified, he also won a date. Richard and Karen purchased their parents a new home on Newville Avenue in where else? Downey. Richard and Karen moved in, unwilling or unable to break up the family nucleus. In late '71, the Carpenters released their 3rd album, The Carpenters, featuring Rainy Days and Mondays and Superstar.
Long ago, and oh so far away, I fell in love with you before the second show.
The Carpenters nearly didn't release the song as Richard felt the lyrics were a bit too racy for Karen. In early 1972, when they finally got a moment at home, Richard and Karen were profiled by local Los Angeles reporter and later anchorman Jerry Dunphy. His television show gave Carpenter fans a rare look at their personal life.
They've sold 16 million records in the past 2 years. Karen, at 21, and Richard, 25, are millionaires. They own apartment houses and shopping centers. They still live at home with their parents in the not especially fashionable community of Downey.
After a brief look around the house, Richard talked with obvious pride about the Carpenters' success.
Well, I guess I could ask, are you a millionaire?
Yeah, we are.
You say we are. Are you a millionaire?
Yeah, Karen and both.
Separately?
Separately,
Not,
yeah.
not together.
No.
You don't have to pool to be a...
No.
Though millionaires, they were not ostentatious. Karen's bedroom wasn't fancy, just thoroughly feminine, home to a menagerie of stuffed animals and Disney memorabilia. Richard's room was exceedingly sparse. The only room that was extensively outfitted was their in-home studio.
We've got quadraphonic sound. That's the newest thing. 4-channel stereo. You know, it's about 125 watts per channel.
Karen took the opportunity to respond to critics who accused Richard of producing blatantly commercial music.
That's one of the things that people think. You know, they say, how did you how did you figure out where to aim and, you know, to sell records? And that's one thing you can't do.
They thought it was a master plan, you know.
Yeah, they do. And it's not, it doesn't happen that way, because you just, what we did was, when we finally did get a chance to cut a record, we just did what we felt we could do the best and the arrangement that came out of his head.
Though relaxed and competent, Richard and Karen were stunned by their sudden success. Richard struggled to explain the Carpenters' appeal.
I'm sure there's some people who would think that, you know, there's some people who think I look like a hippie. I mean, they're that square, that they think that I look wild, or, you know, that we sing rock and roll music just because we have guitar amplifiers.
Yeah.
Then there's other people that think that we're so square that they don't believe how we can exist. But there are people of all ages that, you know, that we do appeal
like
to.
It, yeah.
Coming up, Richard falls in love and infuriates Karen.
The minute that he showed 1 ounce of happiness, I mean, she would have to put the stick between his wheels.
By 1972, the Carpenters were bona fide rock stars. They had money and fame, but they were never able to enjoy them. The next 5 years would be, in essence, a marathon tour, one that eventually took an exacting toll on both Richard and Karen. In 1972, the Carpenters released their 4th album, A Song for You. It featured another hit single, Hurting Each Other. Here is a rare glimpse of the two at work at A&M Studios.
Can we stop hurting each other? We go on hurting each other, making each other.
There were 2 big changes in the Carpenters' camp at this time. First, over Karen's objections, Richard got rid of producer Jack Doherty, remembers Carpenter studio musician Chuck Findlay.
He said to her that he wanted to be the producer or else, you know. Kind of basically, that was the way it was laid out. So he became the producer of the group, and Jack Doherty was gone, and he was history.
Second, Karen was being encouraged to stop hiding behind the drums, recalls Hal Blaine, who was the Carpenters' studio drummer.
I said, why are you even thinking about playing the drums? I mean, you've got all these hit records now, the money's rolling in. You're now, let's face it, a big recording star. You could be up there in front of a microphone leading this thing, singing this thing.
In the middle of 1972, the Carpenters set out on an extensive tour, from Cleveland to Buffalo to Toronto to Memphis. The Carpenters crisscrossed the country, recalls Bill Skiles of Skiles and Henderson, a longtime Carpenter opening act.
They were very young, and first, especially new in traveling on daily grind on these tours. Very difficult. You know, that's hard to do.
And according to former A&M promotions manager Harold Childs, the Carpenters were dead serious about promotion.
They would do interviews all day before they went on stage. They would do interviews backstage. They would do a concert and then come out and sign autographs.
Plus, Karen worried about record sales.
Karen was the business lady. I mean, as far as I know, where's the bullet today? You know, how many records we're selling?
The Carpenters stage show was basically a note-by-note recreation of their hit songs, recalls music critic Paul Grine.
In the early years, they put on very musical shows. There wasn't much flash, there wasn't much personality.
Karen was the consummate professional, remembers comedian Pete Henderson.
4.5 years, I never heard Karen Carpenter hit a sour note. I mean, any off-pitch notes. I mean, she was always bang dead on.
The miles rolled by, New York to San Diego to Las Vegas.
When you come in to do a concert, you run in and you're in there for like a rehearsal during the afternoon, and nobody is usually allowed into the rehearsals. And then you go get dressed and you do the show, and then zoom. You know, you're either gone right away or else you're in the dressing room doing interviews and things.
The Carpenters and their staff and their families and the roadies became a family unto themselves.
They had their world that they traveled with, their portable environment. You might say she had her hairdresser and this and that, and they had the band, and it was like a little fraternity.
Richard and Karen were at the center of the group, and everyone else circled them protectively, especially Karen.
She was protected in a sense, and I can understand her age and how good she was, and everything's riding on her and Richard. A lot of people around were very protective of Karen.
So protected that she rarely dated.
All those years, it was primarily business, and her life was on hold, I think, in romantic versions, whatever. Never the slightest, thought of that with anybody, because nobody was around.
Somebody was around for Richard, however. He fell for a member of the entourage, Maria Galeazzi, who was Karen's hair and wardrobe lady. It was a relationship that would have a lasting effect on Karen, Richard, and their mother Agnes. It started in Brownsville, Texas, on a freezing cold night.
I remember getting in bed and the sheets were wet. We couldn't get heat. I had to go to bed dressed. That's how Richard and I got together. I mean,
Is it too cold?
Try to keep from freezing. That's all it was.
That was enough. Maria and Richard started dating, but manager Sherwin Bash did not approve.
I think he was apprehensive, but, he couldn't stand up to Richard because, Richard obviously had made his decision, and it was his to unmake it.
Nor was Karen pleased.
She was passive-aggressive. In other words, she wasn't verbal. She didn't rant and rave, but I think her aggressiveness came out in another way.
That way, at first, was subtle.
Very seldom did we go out on a date alone. It was usually the three of us. So if Karen went out on a date, then she didn't take us. But if we went out, she came with us.
Later, it was out-and-out harassment.
The minute that he showed 1 ounce of happiness, she would have to put the stick between his wheels. And it was very annoying, I tell you, because I had to not only hold on to the job and do it well, and I didn't have a problem with that, but to have to tolerate her nitpicking and her mannerism towards our relationship. In other words, her reaction all the time.
And guess where Richard was? Stuck between a rock and a hard place.
He, I think, suffered more, even though he just didn't know what to do because he wanted to please me, he wanted to please her, and he didn't want to upset the apple cart.
To get time alone, Richard and Maria would take off in Richard's Ferrari, the centerpiece of his growing car collection. Eventually, Richard got around to telling Mom and Dad about his new girl. Harold was supportive, but not Agnes.
Agnes is more like Karen, very always afraid of what's going on, apprehensive and so forth. I think that because I was so honest and straightforward, that presented a threat.
The tour continued. Lake Tahoe, Toronto, Detroit. Richard on occasion would race while the crew would sightsee. Another diversion was the Carpenters' softball team. Karen, wearing a catcher's mask to protect her face, was the pitcher.
It started out as a little thing, and we had enough roadies, enough people in the band. They're all good players. We had a real top-notch softball, slow pitch softball. Karen was our pitcher.
Smack dab in the middle of this endless tour, in September of 1972, the Carpenters ended up in an improbable location, the White House.
They did a 20-minute show for William Brandt, which is the Chancellor of Germany, and it was very exciting. It was very exciting because it wasn't your usual college gig.
Indeed not. It was very dignified, though Richard did break up the room with an unintended faux pas.
Richard, had the mic on and he didn't realize that it was on. He said, "Who's the broad with Kissinger?" Oops.
The lady was actress Mamie Van Doren.
We think that tonight, having the Carpenters
one of America's finest young group in America entertain us is most appropriate. The Carpenters, ladies and gentlemen.
Willie Brandt and the rest of the invited guests seemed to have a good time, and the Carpenters gave a spirited performance. Listen to Karen's haunting vocals on For All We Know.
Look at the two of us, strangers in many ways. Let's take a lifetime to see. I knew you well, there I
The tour continued. Chicago, St. Louis, Green Bay, Lexington, Kentucky, where the tour plane suffered a minor mishap.
A person that was sitting on the right said, isn't that propeller stopped? And it's like, no, and everybody's going, my ears, and we were so dead tired that, you know, it's like, we don't care. Now we're looking down and saying, what are those guys in the gray suits and all that foam, you know? it was for us. We lost an engine.
More serious, at least to Karen, was her weight.
When I was on the road, she was always on a diet. And she always tried, you know, to not gain weight and all that.
As the tour mercifully wound down, the Carpenters signed to play 2 last concerts in Acapulco. It was for IBM's corporate meeting. Richard was reluctant to go.
Finally, he did go. And we had this wonderful house in Las Brisas called La Silva. And we stayed there, Karen, Richard, and I, and Sherwin and his wife. And the house was just fabulous. It came with personnel, so we didn't have to do anything. We had a party.
The party was short-lived. Richard had invited Harold and Agnes to join them in Acapulco. He put them up in a luxury hotel. Agnes would have preferred to stay with Richard and Karen.
The first night we went out to dinner, Agnes, we were going up the steps of the house to go to get in the car, and Agnes had, you know, really been just bitching at Richard about that the strangers are staying in the house and that his parents were not at the house. How could this be? How could this be that they were not there and we were? And for some reason, I mean, Richard stays pretty calm most of the times. This is the time that I saw him blow. I can't tell you how livid he was with his mom about it.
Richard's anger, like a summer storm, soon disappeared. The rest of the vacation proceeded amicably. Notice this shot of Karen exercising in her bathing suit. She looked fit and trim, yet she confided to Maria that she still felt overweight. From Acapulco, everyone went back to California. In 1972, the Carpenters performed in an amazing 174 concerts. In 1973, there was to be 174 more. Plus, they recorded one of their best-loved tunes, Top of the World. Back in Downey, Karen and Richard settled back into the Newville Avenue house with their parents. Karen seemed normal, even happy, but bubbling just beneath the surface was a cauldron of pain and insecurity and
pressure. Pressure, just good old-fashioned, just good old-fashioned pressure. Just pressure of having to please. You know, even with her wealth and stardom and whatever, she still had to please family, she still had to please the record company, she still had to please the managers, she still had to please Richard, she still had to please, you know, whatever. All those things, you know, all those things were just pressures and pressures and pressures that built up.
The pressures and obligations of her career left Karen feeling powerless, even in the studio. While she was singing, Richard was in charge. It was natural then for her to try and find something she could control, like her weight. Coming up next.
I'd be at A&M a lot, and I'd see Karen. She'd come back from the road, and she would be real skinny, and she looked, and her face was drawn, and I'd say, Karen, I said, I said, you know, what's been going on? She said, well, I just got off a tour. And I said, you need to rest. You need to stay home, get some rest.
The Carpenters spent much of the mid-70s on the road, barnstorming from city to city. Between tours, they were expected to go back into the studio and record. In addition, they appeared on countless television variety shows and specials.
Good evening, and welcome to a show about the things we love, music and the people who make it.
Richard and I could think of no better way to spend an hour than to fill it with music.
Many hours in our lives have been spent that way, and this one tonight is special because it includes America's first lady of song, Miss Ella Fitzgerald.
And a man who's always welcome because he's one of the best friends a good song ever had, John Davidson.
So, after all the hours of music that have preceded this one in our lives, we're very happy to welcome you to one more hour of music, music, music.
That's perfect. The music at the end and everything. Jeff, that's a wrap.
But
See you tomorrow. Well, good night.
An offhand remark before one such television appearance remembers Bob Garcia unintentionally reinforced Karen's insecurities.
I do remember a PR person telling her at one time before a special that she had to lose some weight because you look 30 pounds heavier on camera. And as weird as it sounds,